Welcome to Another Education is Possible, a podcast about education's role in making other worlds. There's this pretty common check-in that is at the start of radical study groups, and it's a question of how did you come here by way of asking, how are you radicalized? And at least for me, that's always been kind of a difficult question to answer. I have some stock answers. I was in college during the Second Iraq War. I had a friend who in high school gave me a book by this guy named Noam Chomsky. And there's this other answer that I'm not sure if I've ever shared, which is that I was listening to music and Rage Against the Machine came on. And I wasn't sure why. I wasn't sure. I know, obviously, they have very explicit leftist lyrics, but I wasn't listening and learning from those lyrics. It just stirred something in me. And I was thinking a lot about this question and my kind of shifting answers after we spoke to today's guest, Saul Brager. A few weeks before the interview, Saul and I were chatting, and I asked the question of, when did you start to break with Zionism? And they shared this interesting and common, very familiar narrative of that they went to Israel on birthright and they saw something they couldn't unsee. They saw the occupation firsthand, and that began the process of moving toward anti-Zionism. That there was something explicit and instructive. And yet, they also shared that in recent years, they've gone back to their journals from those times and saw that, in fact, that wasn't totally the case. That there was something more complex, that in a way, while they were doing Birthright, they had a little bit drunk the Kool-Aid. Which doesn't mean that there isn't an aspect of truth-telling in that narrative. It's just that these questions about how we understand and learn from and then present and narrate both the individual and collective selves is a complex educational undertaking. It deals with how we make sense of ourselves, our histories, and then how we represent and narrate those things. And centrally, as we'll talk about with Saul today, what's the role of art in all of this? So today's episode includes an interview with Saul Brager. Solomon Brager is a cartoonist and writer living in Brooklyn, New York. They are a 2023 to 2025 Jerome Hill Artists Fellow, a member of the Pinko magazine editorial collective, and the director of community engagement at Jewish Currents magazine. Their comics and research have appeared in The Nib, Jewish Currents, Art Forum, World War III Illustrated, Pinko magazine, Refract Journal, and The New Inquiry, among other publications. They hold a PhD from Rutgers University, New Brunswick. A quick note before we begin. About halfway through the interview, you'll hear a different voice ask a question. That's our show's producer, Yardain Amran. In addition to doing the music, editing, and production, you'll occasionally hear Yardain pop in during the interview.
Hey, how's it going?
Good to see you.
Too.
So I actually had something, it's funny, I don't know how relevant this is, but it's brutal down here today. I think in Philly it's like 90 degrees. So just practically, I'm recording at the only place I know that doesn't have air conditioning that's going to overwhelm any sound, which is my parents' place. And I have this, this is a thing that my partner made, which is a picture of my Zadie, my dad, and I at my first Hanukkah. And I mean, maybe it's not. I look like a pretty big baby. But I'm a May birthday, so I don't think I was 6 months there. But I think this is so much of what we're going to talk about today is kind of the way that Jewishness appears in conceptions of the self. And I've now moved that picture down, but I really thought of that, and I think that brings me to a first question for you, which is essentially, since your work is so much about your own self, laying yourself bare, and how the self is projected in literally the word selfies. What did your early self look like? How were constructions of Judaism, Zionism, and your identity being formed in early age?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for for asking that. I mean, I think it's interesting that you uh, shared that photo of you and your Zadie because my Zadie had a really strong bearing on my early sense of myself, particularly as a Jewish person. Even though the book that I wrote, Heavyweight, is about my mother's family, a lot of my, through which I got this sense of my family's connection to the Holocaust. My sense of Jewishness is very much through my father's family, who emigrated from uh, various parts of the Soviet bloc in pre-Soviet bloc in the early 1900s and kind of went straight to Baltimore and were a part of the Orthodox Jewish community in Baltimore. My Zadie and his brother Harry, my uncle Harry, are actually on the cover of like this book called Jewish Baltimore. It's them in the like boys choir of their synagogue when they were youth, and they were like grew up speaking Yiddish, grew up very, very observant. And my father also grew up very observant. And when I was a young child, we went to an Orthodox synagogue. We went to shul pretty often with my grandparents. And, I kind of moved between sitting with my Zadie and my dad in the men's section, and then like going back into the kitchen with my bubby and like getting sun-kissed candies and, like watching all the bubbies like chop vegetables, and then like hanging out with the rabbi's 200 children. And my my Zadie was the president of that shul for some time, so we spent a lot of time there. It's since like many small congregations closed, but sort of like my sense of like, I don't know, core Jewishness is like being in like a hot, stuffy room full of Torah. And then, as I got older and like moved through or moved into Jewish educational spaces, like I went to JCC for preschool and kindergarten, as one does. And my parents were having more children. I have three younger sisters. And my mom, who wasn't raised Jewish, her father is a Jewish Holocaust survivor, child survivor, and her mother comes from a Pennsylvania Dutch family and was Presbyterian. My mom was like really not into the gender segregation and the kind of like intense religiosity and the like, lots of Hebrew with no translation. And so we moved to a conservative synagogue in Baltimore that was like very much the kind of Zionist Jewish space that, we often think of and talk about when we think of American Jewish education, where, I was going to Hebrew school 3 days a week, and that education was like very split between like Israel education and religious education in an actually very integrated way. That there was the sort of like symbolic the symbolic touchstone, the Israeli flag on the bima. A lot of our Hebrew school teachers were Israeli. It was just like very, very integrated, and kind of like filled the gaps that were left by the like sort of paucity of Torah learning in my mind, and so I, in many ways, was like very into Jewishness in general. Like I was very drawn to anything having to do with like folklore or Yiddishkeit, or like just like anything that was like kind of culturally interesting at all. And also I was like a morbid child who was like drawn to lachrymose Jewish history. And then also like kind of Jewish mysticism had a big draw for me, which is all to say I was a huge nerd. And so like I loved Hebrew school, and I like loved Torah, and I like loved praying, and I like thought I wanted to be a rabbi, and that was like very cool for everyone around me, except for like other children who thought I was a nerd. So I don't know if that's like the basic overview.
Yeah. And was this always kind of inextricably linked for you to Israel? Not just the education that you received, but as you took up things like mysticism, you thought of that through a lens of what would probably later be called Zionism. I don't know if you were explicitly using that term as a child, but did you think of these things as a project that was related to Israel?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that like something that is very true um, of Jewish like Jewish imbrication with the state of Israel in a U.S. context is that until the sort of like incursion of anti-Zionism, or like the pushback of Palestine activism, we really weren't talking about Zionism at all. Like Israel was just a totally natural fact in my life. And there wasn't like a lot of questioning. There was always this sort of like sense that we should strengthen our relationship to Israel, but there wasn't like a sort of sense that, it was like I wasn't thinking about it very much. And I wasn't, as a child, really thinking about my relationship to the nation state. So Israel for me, in as much as I was like drawn to it, was like, sometimes Israelis like seemed more like woo or like interested in like things that felt like foreign to me. And that was interesting to me as a child. But like the things that I was really drawn to were like the stories of Shalom Aleichem and like stuff about golems and Dybbuk and like Kabbalah and like Hasidic stuff. Like there was something that was like mystical about Hasidic stuff. And like Israel is not mystical. It's like it's a fascist nation state, So like I was never like, what I want to do is like march around and like pretend to be a soldier. Like, and also for a nerdy child, like the sort of like muscular Judaism of Israel is like really off-putting. I was bullied by a lot of Israeli children in Baltimore, so
yeah.
So maybe it was never that for me,
Yeah. Yeah. But you were certainly educated into a Zionist world, but maybe there was something unnamed, like kind of residing below your consciousness about, I don't know, the way that this has been masculinized is not for me. The way that this is, you didn't say fascist as a child. Maybe, I don't know. You did sound quite introspective and well, you said it, nerdy, but just to try to sound young for a second, the vibe was off.
Yeah, the vibe was off. Yeah, the vibe was off. But I also like, I will say like the places that I was drawn to it were these sort of, and when I speak to older people who lean more left, which, to be clear, my family was never left. Like my grandparents were Republicans. My parents were Republicans until Trump, and now they're, whatever Biden voters are. And like, I was like really when I speak to like older people who lean left, who like went to Israel in the 70s and have this like dream of the like kibbutz still, where they're like, we like all ate together and it was so beautiful and we all worked together and it was like the dream of like the socialist dream or whatever. And even like the dream of like cohabitation that like, you'll like talk to Palestinians who were there and they're like, that is not what was happening. But like that drew me a little bit, like where I also was like so fascinated by the idea of like living under violence. In the same, like I'm trying to remember the name of this book that I looked it up recently, but there's like this like YA book that I read in school that was like about a young American girl who moves to the kibbutz and then like is immediately confronted not only by this like foreign culture that is supposedly her culture, but then also by the reality of violence of Palestinian uprising. And I was like, what must it be like to live under the violence of Palestinian uprising? And I kind of like in my mind it was like it probably was a lot like living in Nazi Germany. There's like this like outside threat, which is like I think very much what a lot of a lot of Hezbollah would really like us to be thinking about when we think of those two things together.
Yeah. So even with opposition to maybe the image of the tough, macho, masculine Jew that a lot of Israeli Americans were putting off, there wasn't a full questioning of Israel. You were being educated toward Israel was always going to be part of your future.
Yeah, totally. And like they're also, again, to like think about how, I wasn't thinking about the nation state. Like there wasn't a clear separation in my mind. And again, this is something that Hasbaris really want us to be thinking about. There wasn't a clear separation in my mind between like the Israel of like the Torah and like the Israel of today, or like that seemed like a very clear, like I was like, of course it's like, the Israel of the Torah is like cooler and like more, more scary, but like, more interesting to me. But it's the same place and it's the same people.
Right. Next year in Jerusalem means literally next year we'll be in the city of Jerusalem in the nation state of Israel. It's not up for interpretation.
And I have I think this is why I like ultimately have become as far left as I am, is because I have like a utopian impulse within me. And so like, I am the type of person where like when you say next year in Jerusalem, I like feel the like swell of feeling that brings. And it's like, I now like when people say that, I'm like, it's figurative. So I like still have the swell of feeling. It doesn't mean, next year like we'll all be there and then like the end of the world will come or whatever. Like, or it's not like it's not the like evangelical take or the like nationalist take. It's like the literal like next year like we will come to a better place. Like next year things will be better and we'll be together.
I always read that as a promissory note, right? It's a promissory note, however you say it. That it's a hope, it's a promise. It begs us towards utopian thinking. Who else was involved here? So we have kind of the family educating you in this warm embrace that didn't explicitly have much to do with Israel. But I would imagine that Zionism was wrapping around every aspect in some way. Were there lessons, educators beyond folks at the JCC, beyond this YA novel that's kind of teaching you about Israel as this magical land?
Yes, which we've gotten a note that the book in question is One More River by Lynn Reed Banks, which actually was the site of a book ban, or not a book ban, but a book challenge scandal at Sudbrook Middle School, where the Muslim parents and the Jewish parents were they like got the Lynn Reed Banks book taken off the syllabus and a Naomi Shihab Nye book put on the syllabus, and then the Jewish parents were pissed about that and came in and tried to get that taken off, which like is so funny. I'm like, I can't, and this is like a memory that like came to me recently because I like saw the Naomi Shihab Nye book cover and I was like, oh my God, I completely forgot about this. But yeah, I mean, and it's interesting because the Israel stuff like in my family, got very intense later, but like I don't remember it being really huge like as a child. Again, it was like just the kind of like water we were swimming in. But it is interesting. Like I grew up in suburban Baltimore in, a series of different suburbs, like for anyone who's from that part of the world, like I grew up in Pikesville, Owings Mills, and then Reisterstown. And these are like all extremely Jewish areas. Like my parents grew up in Randallstown, that like almost all of the white people who live there are Jewish. Everyone is kind of like on board with the same vibe. And it's just like so compulsory, or like compulsory isn't even the word, because it's like there's just no question. It's like not even on the table to ask these questions. And again, that has changed a lot. Like, but when I was a kid, that is definitely that was definitely the story. And so it's hard to like pinpoint. Like, it would be an easier question to be like, was there anyone who wasn't teaching you about Israel in this like clearly Zionist way? I went to like Jewish day camp. I went to Jewish sleepaway camp, and like everything was just like, we had like Israel Day at camp, and we had like these activities like at Hebrew school where a bunch of Israelis would come, and then we would like pretend to be like Zionist militia members in 48, like, army crawling against the British or something. And they would like have sirens going overhead. And then we had like a lady come, and she like stood behind a velvet rope, and she was like, I am the last Jew. I am the last Jew because you married non-Jews and weren't good enough Jews. You did this to me. And I'm like, okay, I guess I have to marry a Jew. So it was very, and also like I grew up.
It's hilarious.
Like, yeah, it's ridiculous. Like, but I grew up in the 90s. Like I grew up in like the like Gulf War era in a lot of ways, and then my like it came into like consciousness, as like a teenager, in the moment of 9/11. So there wasn't just a religious Zionism. There was also like the deep Islamophobia and colonial impulse and political Zionism of the entire country around me.
Yeah, which I would imagine we'll come to in a little bit, but I would imagine that's also where space becomes open to start questioning that. I think something that popped in my head as you're talking, a few things. One is, we'll also talk about, if you want, Birthright. And I was already with my partner in Birthright, but I just remember beyond all the other propaganda, it was basically you all should fuck. Everybody should fuck because we need Jewish babies. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So I think something, you're pushing me back to grad school books that kind of echo around vaguely in my brain here, but I'm thinking of this book that I'm sure is pretty well known, Capitalist Realism, which, if I'm remembering correctly, talks about the idea that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than an end of capitalism. And it sounds like what you're saying, which really echoes with me, is that almost there was no education was non-existent. It was almost like it was just the atmosphere was what it was. There was no questioning it. There was no otherwise to be seen.
Yeah, the only reason that quote is like not entirely applicable, which I love that quote, and also there's like a little bit more of a like Fortress on the Hill kind of vibe, where see, now I'm going to say vibe over and over again. You brought it into the room, but where like not only was it, there was no questioning it, and it was just like totally naturalized, but then also the thing that made it so functional was the constant threat of an end, right? Like that there is a sort of like apocalyptic edge to the naturalization, where like the reason that you have to do these things, the reason that you have to support this state, the reason that, we like are constantly saying these things or doing these things, or like, planting a tree in Israel, or like whatever it is like because we have, eternal enemies that are constantly coming for us. And there's like always the threat, not only of the end of the state, but of the end of the Jewish people.
Right.
And that like, it's on your shoulders, ye young Jews, to like make sure that that doesn't happen through your actions.
Yeah. And yeah, I'd always been taught,
Which is very Christian, by the way.
Can you say a little bit more about that? Why is that?
Well, because the whole thing with Christianity is like individual sin, right? It's like that the things that you are doing is like going to cause some sort of like negative outcome, right? So this idea that like we're functioning through the threat of like young people sinning is like, I think like so goyisha. Like, I don't know if you know the Lenny Bruce joke that's like Jewish or goyish.
Yeah.
I think about it all the time, and I'm like, Israel is goyish. It's so goyish. Like,
yeah. I think that this is a podcast more about educational journeys, but I think anybody who has Google can look into the deep ties between a Christianity that is, yeah, I in short will agree. It is a very goyish place. So if we're looking at this as something that's fully wrapped around your life, that you said, I couldn't think of somebody who wasn't this way. The question of, if my teachers are all this way, there was nobody who wasn't this way. How did you start moving away from this?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's a question that I have been thinking about a lot, about, how was there like a crack that the light could get in? How did you get out of this like totally totally consuming worldview? And I think that there are a lot of answers that are like not that helpful, that I nevertheless think are a little bit true. One being that I'm a queer and trans person, and queer and trans people are very disproportionately represented among the ranks of anti-Zionist Jews. And there's a reason for that. Like, when you already are having to take steps to separate yourself from from your community and family in a way that is going to be painful for everyone, particularly when you're from a more religious community or a politically conservative community, often with a lot of overlap, where you just have to start questioning everything that you've been told. That like, when I got bat mitzvah, they were like, now, we'll see you next at the chuppah. Here's like some candlesticks. And I was like, this feels weird. And then I was like, what else feels weird? More things. So there's an element to which, once you've already started to like separate yourself a little, or once there's already like a level of discomfort, that you can ask more questions. But that's, that only works for people who have some sort of like inborn sense of difference or whatever. Or, that they caught being trans on TikTok and so another piece that was really helpful for me, which again is not everyone's story, but I got out of my community in a number of ways. One of which, again, I don't like recommend this or think this is for everyone, but I got expelled from my high school for minor dabbling in recreational drugs. And the high school that I ended up going to instead, I was one of a very, very small number of Jews versus my original high school that was like, if you were white at that school, you were Jewish. And my kind of sense of how the world worked was shaken up in a pretty major way, in a number of ways. And some of this was just because I was with people who were different from me. And some of it was also that I went from going to high school in, kind of like, again, a very like Jewish kind of mixed class suburb of Baltimore to a
more educated, like not necessarily economically upper class, but like a more educated upper class part of Baltimore County, that was in a college town. So I went to high school in Towson, like literally across the street from Towson University, down the street from Goucher. And a lot of the kids that I ended up going to high school with, their parents were professors. They, might have been like, they were engaging in like academic or intellectual life in a way that I had no access to, even though I was a really big reader. Like my mom always jokes that when I was a kid, I would read the entire back of the cereal box. And I'm like, well, mom, maybe we should have more books in the house. Like if I was like, and to be fair, we had a lot of books, but like no one could keep up with the number of books that I was reading. Um, so I had these experiences where like I always joke that like I showed up at this school and on the first day someone like biked up to me on a fixed gear and was like, you come into critical mass after school, also have you read Noam Chomsky? And it was a little bit like that. And so I went on Birthright while I was a student at that school, because I went, and this was like a Birthright partnership with the Baltimore Zionist District, so it was for I think like 16 to 18-year-olds instead of like 18 to 24 or 26 or whatever the like classic Birthright age group is. And so I went when I was 17 and I was a student at this school, and my friends were like, what are you doing? Like, this is bad. And they really were like pushing literature on me. And I really like felt under attack, by this, but in a way where I was like, I had strong enough relationships with the people who were challenging me that I like wanted to understand why they were upset by what I was doing. And so I was reading the literature and I was like reading the texts, and the spaces that I was hanging out in were like very explicitly anti-Zionist spaces. And I wanted to be in those spaces for social reasons, for political reasons. Like they were, like Red Emma's coffee shop and bookstore in Baltimore was like where I felt like I had found a home and like my people, and that was like the coolest place that could possibly exist. And it was like brand new when I was in high school, which is wild because it means it's almost 20 years old now. And I like wanted to be there. So to be there, I had to like either be uncomfortable about this like one pretty big political issue, or like have answers to the questions that I was being asked about it. And when I was being asked the question and like tried to find the answer, what I came to was actually much closer to the views of the people who were asking the question than to the view that I thought I had had.
Do you remember any of the specific texts that friends were sharing with you?
That is a great question. I feel like I'll have to like pull up a reading list. I mean, I assume Noam Chomsky and Norm Finkelstein were in there. I do remember like the Holocaust industry and maybe, I don't know, I have to check when that book came out because I'm like, what year did that come out? Yeah. But some of it was also in the form of like zines. There was also some like, just some like voices in the community that loomed really large for me. Mark Gunnery, who he was working at the Jewish Museum of Maryland until really recently, and he left to go pursue his graduate research on the Sabbatai Zevi, the Sabbateans, which I'm very interested to read in the future. But when I was in high school, he's maybe like 10 years older than me. He had gone to Beth Phila, which was like the Orthodox Jewish day school that everyone I knew went to, and I worked at their summer camp. But like he was like very much from the same background as me, and he was like older and hanging out with these punks in Baltimore and singing like really interesting folk songs that included explicitly anti-Zionist stuff. And he was like collaborating with this Baltimore City high school teacher who performs under the name Son of None, who, there's a thing, like I've seen him perform many times before, it's many times since the first time that I saw this, but I have this like clear memory of seeing him perform. And there's one song where he gets the entire audience to chant Intifada over and over again. And I remember like the first time I heard that or experienced that, I felt like I was being physically attacked. And then like the set and and I told people I was uncomfortable, and they were like, why do you feel uncomfortable? Like, what, tell us what feels uncomfortable about this. And I had to name it. And then like the second time I was like, I still feel uncomfortable, but like I understand that I'm not under attack. And then the third time I was like, okay, like this is actually fine. Like, and then by like the fifth time I like was like, I understand what intifada is, and I'm like fairly on board actually. So, just like being, there was something about those spaces that had enough draw for me and enough comfort for me and enough people in them that I wanted to be around, that I was like okay with being uncomfortable. And I think that not to be like, not to jump to like the encampments of today, but I feel like I hear that from particularly Jewish students who experience the encampments for Gaza this past school year, where like sometimes things happen in those encampments that did feel really uncomfortable or like maybe felt bad, but there was something compelling enough about being in them, or comfortable enough, or like the people, there were enough good conversations happening that like sometimes it was okay to disagree or feel uncomfortable or feel a little bit threatened in a way that like wasn't physical or like maybe wasn't real, but was a real feeling.
Yeah, there's a great piece in educational research called Pedagogies of Discomfort. And I think that's such an important part of the work of liberating the self, of liberatory work in general. And it's definitely not to take away anything from your experience, but this is also very recognizable. I think the connection to the encampments is so true. I think going to a radical bookstore, I would imagine many folks will know Red Emma's, and encountering folks like Chomsky who are starting to challenge you is a very familiar path. But then that's so often countered with the other side. So I'm wondering what it looked like during this time where everything was kind of being ruptured, and then you're coming home, you're 17, so you're still going home to your family, you're still participating in Jewish life that doesn't look like that. And I would imagine there's some jarring and conflicting and a lot of stuff kind of.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. Yeah. I mean, it was very jarring and conflicting. And, like, I think that because I'm very vocally anti-Zionist, like sometimes people will say, like, how did you like get to a place of like, how did you convince your family that you were right? And I'm like, okay, just because I like talk to them still doesn't mean that I convince them that I'm right. We fight a lot. Like things are not great all the time. But that jarring factor is still there. The last time I went home, which was like, just a couple of weeks ago, I pulled up to my parents' house and they have one of those like flags in their front yard that's like half an American flag and half an Israeli flag. Yeah. And I'm like, there is that moment where I'm like, am I going to walk into this house? Like, what is going to happen here? And that's very uncomfortable and it sucks, frankly. But there was always this sort of like my parents are not people who are afraid of conflict, and they actually really like debating. And so, one of the greatest gifts that my father gave me was like arguing at the breakfast table and the dinner table, to the point where like when we started doing it, I would get really emotional and sometimes I would cry because I felt frustrated, or I like that he was like very he didn't like hold back in his debate style, and that like really helped me develop a very thick skin. And I think that the extent of their like refusal to sort of coddle my political beliefs was like really good for my ability to then take those political beliefs into the world. But also I have had very little luck in like convincing them of anything. Like I will go home and my mother will make me pancakes, and this is like now, not like when I was a teenager. And then she'll like slide a piece of paper across the counter, and it'll be like a list of all the expulsions of Jews from Arab countries in, like since 48. And she's like, well, answer this. And I'm like, can I eat breakfast first, or should we go right to me, talking about Middle East politics? I don't know. Like, again, which is like not my area of expertise at all. Like, I studied German colonialism, but like I can talk about it if you want. But like, as a teenager, honestly, I was very secretive. Like, I didn't come out to my parents as gay until I was like in my 20s, and I was like a gay teenager. And I didn't come out to them as an anti-Zionist until they like found me out, which was also like in my 20s. And I just kind of like thought they would disown me, which I felt, it was not something that I wanted to happen. And as it turns out, I cannot escape them. They will not disown me.
There's something really beautiful there. I think I'm thinking of two things. That one, just the refusal to be silent, but also just to, I think I hear so often like, well, we just don't talk about politics and we get along. And I find that so often. And to know that there's still family there that, will fight and have problems, and all of that is wonderful. But I also I'm finding, maybe if we could start talking about your work a little bit, it's so interesting and surprising getting, I reached out to you reading your work in Jewish Currents and starting to follow you on Instagram. And a lot of the notes that I was taking and preparing for this interview are about how so much of your work is about living publicly, is about bringing out yourself and working through all of this in a visible way. And to hear then that you're, that a lot of this, I'll call it educative life as a youth and even into your early 20s was kind of held in, at least to your family, is very different. So I've before we start talking about kind of from the everything kind of coming apart and unlearning and turning to the work that you're doing now, I've one thing written down that I'm going to actually just read it from the interview notes. So I say that your book, Heavyweights, is coming out, and we can talk about that in more detail in a little bit, but there was a comic in Jewish Currents a few years ago that talks about your Opa. I believe that's your great-grandfather, or is that your grandfather? Okay. And it's about learning who this person was and having kind of these rising feelings of connection and hope, and then feeling deflated and back and forth as you learn about connections between you and your Opa, who was a boxer, was not a Zionist, but in a very different way. And I'm wondering about these kinds of this memory work that you went through, and how that contributed to unlearning Zionism.
Yeah, I think that, my particular connection to this familial and historical figure of Eric Levy, who is my great-grandfather and who's also a German heavyweight boxing champion in the 1910s, and who died in 1955. Like, I never met him. My mother never met him. Is like in some ways about the ease of connecting to someone that you don't have to interact with. And there are these things about him, like his negative qualities feel very familiar to me because they feel like qualities that I have, that my mother has, that, her father has, her siblings have, which is like this sort of like draw towards conflict, this sort of like stubbornness, like the things that made him a good boxer and a kind of bad dad, and then also these kind of like historical facts about him, like his interest in beating up Nazis, which I identified very heavily with. I'm not a person that beats people up, but I don't not advocate beating up Nazis for beating up Nazis. It felt compelling to me. And also, his kind of like disinterest in leaving Germany ever, like in a way where like leaving Germany for his wife, my great grandmother, who I did know through my early 20s. She lived a very long life. For her, leaving Germany felt totally natural. Like she loved to travel. She was one of those people who could kind of live anywhere. Like she was like a true diasporist in that sense. But for my great grandfather, he was intensely German. Like that was like what he wanted for his life. And he like did not do well outside of Germany. And that was really interesting to me because increasingly in my family, particularly like over the last couple decades, like the post 9/11 era, we'll say, there was like this real leaning into the idea of Israel as like our homeland. And then the more information that I received, like the more I was kind of getting a sense that like Germany is our homeland, actually, that like, we have like hundreds and hundreds of years. Like when I look to Israel, I don't actually see any personal history. I don't find any personal connection. I don't find any people that I feel ties to. And then when I look to Germany, I like find all of those things in a container that is really painful, and in a country that is also very bad, like like the country that I grew up in, and the country that is like none of these countries are good, but there was like this sort of alternative narrative there. And I think like the thing that has always been interesting to me about history, and this really like one of the first books that like I was given by one of my friends from the Towson era was like Howard Zinn's The People's History. And that thread of like historical work where it's just like, what if we paid attention to these different things? What if we like talked to different people, or, just like turned the globe a little? Like, what is the story that you'll find, and how does it shift the story that we've been telling? That's always been really compelling to me and really interesting. And, I think I like was drawn to doing that to my own personal history. Like there was like a story that I was getting and it didn't quite make sense. And then when I like turned the I don't know why it's the globe, but like, when I like shifted the lens a little bit, it made a lot more sense, but it like broke down the story that I had received.
Yeah. So can we start talking a little bit about your work? Because I think, there are supposed to be these three moves in the podcast of the world that you learned, the world that you unlearned, and how through unlearning you're now studying, educating yourself and others, working toward both Jewish and Palestinian futures that are other than what we have now. So I have a few notes about your work, and I'm happy to talk about many pieces. But one of the ones that, in preparing for this, that Yardane and I were really excited for was the hostage one. Could you just talk a little bit about what that is and kind of how it came together?
Yeah, totally. So Put Up, Take Down is a comic that was published in February for Jewish Currents magazine. That is a examination of the hostage poster campaign that started in the days immediately after the October 7th attack in Israel, and continues into the present. And I don't know what it was like to be in New York in the days right after October 7th, because I was at a multi-directional memory of the Holocaust and colonialism conference in rural Germany, which was like a really gentle, I mean, it could have been like the Jewish version of Get Out, but it ended up being like a very gentle place to sort of like acclimate to a growing horror. in a lot of ways. And then I like landed back in New York, and like every surface of the city was like plastered in these posters that I'm sure people listening to this have seen, but if they haven't, they are like a classic kidnapped poster, like, where it just says kidnapped across the top, and it's all like red and black and like very stark. And they have the images of the hostages, the Israeli and people of other nationalities who were in Israel, hostages who were taken by Hamas on October 7th and held in Gaza. And the text on them was like very, to me, read as like very jarring and violent. And they felt to me, again, as a real provocation towards retaliatory violence. Like I was sort of like immediately put off by them in a way where I was both like, yeah, this is like really horrific. I can't imagine having this happen to someone that I love. And also I don't like these posters. And my inclination, which, I would hope is like an effect that comes out of most people's experience of school, particularly college, my inclination is, instead of having like a knee-jerk reaction, is to ask a set of questions. And, the questions that I had were like, who made these? What are they for? What impact are they having? Is it possible that they're for something other than what I think they are? And so I started by talking to the people who made the campaign. And a thing that was really interesting, and to people who were putting the posters up. And then I went on to talk to people who, there was like a growing campaign of doxing against people who took the posters down. And I talked to people who had gotten doxxed for taking the posters down. And also, like went back and read a bunch of stuff on colonial affect and the work of like visual memorial culture. And I started doing this like in October and did it over months and like read all the like kind of knee-jerk or like quick release think pieces that came out about it that were like, the only reason someone would be tearing these down is because they're Hamas supporters who like hate Jews, and and I hope, and the feedback that I've gotten is that I did try to put together like a more complex story of what was happening there, where the intention of these posters was, in the words of the people who made the campaign, to garner international support for getting the hostages back, which in their minds was by any means necessary, including endless war. And so, there was a potential, like that was on the table for them, right? That like a call for ceasefire did not feel compelling to them, for example. A call for a hostage deal, like everyone for everyone, was not compelling to them. And then, I also like ended up talking to people, for example, who have family members who were taken hostage. And for them, particularly people who live in Israel, the posters are used as an indictment of the state, precisely for not accepting a ceasefire and a hostage deal to get their loved ones back, right? So they're functioning in very different ways in different places. And I think that's true of like most visual culture in a transnational or like increasingly globalized context. And it is like important and interesting to kind of tease out how that's happening. So that was like the story of how that came together and came to be. And the reason that I did it was just because I was like, I need something to like grasp onto in this moment. And like, these are the things that are like hitting me, like, I like almost literally hitting me in the face constantly. They're just like blowing around in the breeze and like smacking me in the face. And I like couldn't stop thinking about them because I like couldn't stop encountering them. And it felt like a place where I could enter. Like, I wasn't like, I didn't have anything sort of like new or like clarifying to say about like the unfolding genocide that would like have any impact. I was like, thank God, like Roz wrote, that piece for Jewish Currents. Like I was like hearing people saying great things about that, and I like wasn't hearing anything good about this like one very small piece that I could say something about.
Yeah, I was just going to say that for me, speaking educationally, there is something that forced a recognition that I couldn't name. That I had that knee-jerk reaction of, I don't like these. I want to tear them down. Also, I don't want to get doxxed, and I don't have tenure yet and all that. But also, there was something more to it of, I got pulled back, the pendulum swung the other way, and I'm like, but how callous can I be towards, I want to imagine myself in this position. And I think it just brought forth something. It kind of taught me in this very interesting way how to wrestle with this. But yeah, Yardain, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to name that it feels not inconsequential at all, in the sense that the hostage posters, in many ways, to me at least, felt like one of a central places of terrain of contestation in the diaspora, in New York at least. And so I found your analysis really clarifying. I just wanted to read a little piece of it, maybe, and then ask you a quick follow-up on what you just spoke about. You sort of get to it at the end where you're like, this is what the obsession with the posters seems to be about. It provides justification for American Jewish fear. There is an investment in Jewish endangerment, in maintaining a sense of being under threat, an invitation to see myself as a victim. And I guess I just wanted to ask about victimhood a bit, and the reproduction of that narrative as sort of a really central component of Jewish identity, at least in my experience growing up in both in the beginning Orthodox and then secular communities. And I wanted to ask like how that sort of relates to how you see that changing, maybe as this most recent iteration of the conflict has sort of unfolded. Do you see victimhood in the same way as sort of you experienced it growing up, or do you see sort of cracks or different pieces sort of developing?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think like my understanding of like the broad narrative of Jewish history, which is like so informed by the analysis of like lachrymose storytelling, is like that one can only understand Jews as eternal victims if one ignores wide swaths of both Jewish experience in different places in the world, and also like large chunks of actual years in which Jews were like doing pretty well. And then also like if you only look at the Jewish relationship to a dominant population and not to other subjugated populations that Jews, for example, might have been really terrible to. So, sort of like thinking about this like very singular narrative of victimization, and like refusing to zoom out and look at a broader story. I think that like my kind of understanding of Jewish victimhood in the context of what's happening now is like entirely informed by whiteness and the anxiety of whiteness and the kind of like buy-in. I mean, it's really interesting because actually like one of the like really operative anti-Semitic right-wing theories that circulates now is about the Great Replacement theory, right? Which is like the idea that Jews are orchestrating people of color to infiltrate and replace white populations in Western nations. And yet there's a kind of buy-in to this same anxiety where it is like the fear that I'm seeing from Jews is like both tied to lachrymose history. It's like tied to this feeling about the Holocaust, about, all of these like many expulsions and the pogroms and the Inquisition and the fall of the temple. But it actually is much more similar to the kind of white fear of replacement, of loss of power. And I often like turn back to, this passage from Frantz Fanon's work, where he is like talking about being in a train station and this white child seeing him and like turning to his mother and saying like, "Mother, the Negro is like going to eat me." And like this child is like full of fear, like is like shaking with fear because he's encountered a Black man in public space, right? And that child's fear feels real to him, but the danger is entirely on Frantz Fanon, right? It's entirely on the Black man in public space who is like at actual threat of death in that moment. And so it's really interesting because it like calls into question our ability to trust like our gut feeling. And I think that like, there's a real gut feeling of victimization and fear and danger and like threat of death in American Jewish communities right now. And that we actually can't trust that feeling. And that's like a very rough position to be in, because it's like you actually have to like backtrack on your own effective relationship to yourself and to information. And, I highly recommend therapy. Which is not a joke, honestly.
No,
like,
100%, 100%.
Like sometimes you have to like take a breath and be like, am I in, I had this like therapist who otherwise was not very helpful, but she in grad school, but she gave me this like little card, and on one side was a tiger and on the other side was a kitten. And it was like, is this dangerous or am I just uncomfortable? Right. Like, and I feel like everyone should like have like that card sort of like embedded in their mind, where it's like, you should just be able to take a step back. And then also actually to add the question of like, is this dangerous or am I just uncomfortable? And in my discomfort, am I actually going to endanger another person? And, or another group of people. And I think we're, as a community, Jews are doing a terrible job of that, which is a real understatement. But I think that like, there's something, there's something we really need to figure out there as a people.
Yeah. I think what's interesting there though is, I'll speak personally that I've been involved in organizing work for, I was kind of radicalized in a similar way to you. Of somebody said, "Hey, I'm a vegan and I read Noam Chomsky, and there's this bookstore in Philadelphia called the Wooden Shoe," and but for me, it was always a split. I was divided. There was my organizing and my work as a leftist, and I was always a Jew because I kind of have a weird way of talking, and I get very nervous, and I get read as, I'm very tall, but when I grow my hair out and all this and start rambling, all of this gets read in a certain way. But then I would come home and it would look a different way. But so many people now are saying, this is the first time I've organized as a Jew. This is the first time and that's true for myself as well. I've been an anti-Zionist for a long time, but I always thought of that as a point of shame. But I think what you're saying is, and what I'm seeing from a lot of your work, is that you're learning through your Jewishness and expressing things through your Jewishness. And I don't know if you want to talk about the project that you're about to start. We we talked a little bit before this began about the Nova Festival, but that's one thing that comes to mind about, I'm basically thinking of, for so many people, there would be a refusal to engage these things, right? You finished by saying, we as the Jewish community have so much work to do with these things. And for me, there's often an impulse to say, so let's just not do it. Let's just do the work of Palestinian liberation, and Jewishness doesn't need to be engaged in that kind of way. But your work doesn't do that.
I think, I'm really compelled by the question of like, why engage this through a Jewish lens? Like, why not just say like, forget Jewish stuff, forget Jews, let's do the work of Palestine liberation. And I think that's incredibly fair. And also I think that is actually what like the movement should be doing. Like, I don't think it is the work of Palestinians or those invested in Palestinian liberation to think about the Jews. I do think that like it is worthwhile to think about the ways in which anti-Semitism can infiltrate a movement, but that is like very separate from like worrying about Jews. And for whatever reason, whether it's like my background or my interests or like, the things that I like trip and fall into, I keep getting sucked back into Jewish community and into like my own relationship to Jewishness. I often try to like make work that is like not about Jews, and it like rarely pans out. And so, to a certain extent, like this is just the project that like I feel a compulsion towards, and that like the people that I am working with have also, for whatever reason, felt drawn towards. And like, if like by doing this work, I can create some sort of like future for Jews, that would be like a great outcome. I don't know why I'm so invested in Jewish futurity, but like here it is. But and I hopefully I'll like get to something that was compelling to you when we talked about this like Nova Memorial. But the project that I'm thinking about doing, or that I'm researching, is like starting through this kind of uncanny and I think in very poor taste memorial project that is currently, I believe, like on Wall Street right now. It's like in like FiDi in Manhattan. That's just like a giant warehouse where they've set up panoramas of, I guess we'll say, artifacts or evidence collected from the Nova Music Festival massacre site from October 7th. And I guess there's like, and again, I'm going later this evening, so, I'll report back. But my sense is like, that it is set up to create a emotional experience that gives people the sense that they are somehow at the festival, or are somehow like moving through the actual space of the festival in a way that is meant to evoke a sense of trauma and a sense of solidarity with Israelis, and a sense of a need for revenge. And that has borne out from the feedback that they're getting at the, like someone posted on Twitter recently a bunch of the like cards that visitors leave. And, they say things like, like there are no innocent Gazans, like raise Amalek to the ground. Like people are writing really horrific, violent things in response to this exhibit. And my sense is that is what the exhibit is for. It is to do that, right? And my my graduate work, my dissertation, was about the afterlives of German colonialism and the Holocaust in a transnational context, and like really looking at the construction and function of memory cultures, and particularly visual memory cultures. So thinking about things like the Shoah Foundation's use of holograms to try to like get people to like feel like they're talking to real Holocaust survivors, and all of these sort of like uncanny projects, or like the projects that don't exist. The fact that like people to this day like don't know about the German genocide in what is now Namibia. That like we pick and choose, and we like construct the things that we want people to memorialize and to care about, and we create the effective responses that we want to see. All of that is invented, right? Like we do it to ourselves. And so, the question for me is like, what does telling the story that we choose to tell in the way that we choose to tell it do? And then what is the alternative? Like, what could we be doing instead to get it like a different outcome? Like, there's no planet on which I think people should be like forbidden from memorializing or remembering or mourning massacre victims, regardless of the political underpinnings or the like reasons for that massacre having taken place. But I don't think that this is an act of mourning. Like I think it's an act of grievance, right? Versus grief. So I don't know if that was like what you wanted to get at, but and hopefully I'll draw a comic about it.
I have two more things that I want to ask. And they're really just thinking about how your work is pushing towards other ways of thinking, other ways of learning. And one that really took me was the radical calendar. To me, that's such a great example of what's called public pedagogy. And I think about that because, whether it was visiting my Bubby and Zadie, my aunt and uncle, even at my house, there's always the Jewish calendar on the wall. And it was, like we talked about earlier, this taken for granted thing. And looking at that radical calendar, it suddenly thrust this new, I had to reconfigure how I understood what the Jewish calendar is, what it does, and challenge the assumptions that I had learned and internalized about everything. And I'm wondering kind of how that came together and what that project looked like in terms of your involvement.
Yeah, I can take very little credit for having been involved in the development of this project. The Radical Jewish Calendar is the brainchild of rabbis Jessica Rosenberg and Ariana Katz, who, at the time were rabbinical students in Philadelphia at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College. At the same time that I was doing my dissertation work, I was also living in Philadelphia. I was finishing my graduate work at Rutgers. And, I was in that phase of grad school where I had a lot of time on my hands. At the time, I don't know if I even really felt compelled by the project of making a Jewish calendar. Like I saw that there was an issue with the Jewish calendars that exist. In terms of tying the Jewish year cycle and the holiday cycle, and the counting of the Omer and all these kind of sacred things, right? To these many photos of quote unquote holy places that are, the sort of archaeological project of claiming the Holy Land as a nation state. And they just needed art for it, right? And I was like, I can make art. And then they needed to figure out how to ship it. And I was like, I have a label printer, right? I was like, I make zines and I know how to do this. So let's get to it. The DIY project is a Philadelphia staple, and it was very much in my wheelhouse, and it was a great excuse to hang out with Jessica and Ariana. And also artist named Kate Poole, who also was helping with it at that time. And, over the years, this entire sort of collective has formed around this calendar project. And, in part because of like the incredible demand for it. Like it, they make more every year and it sells out every year. The need for it became very clear to me. And also like as you were saying, the kind of like pedagogical quality of it, where just like having something different in public space makes a huge difference. And being given an alternative allows people to think differently about what they have been given. And so, I've been on the like art selection committee. I've contributed work to it. And it just like continues to be this like very clear, site of intervention. And I think like, in terms of my other work, I mean, and sorry, Jessica and Ariana just came out with a book that came out on Wayne State Press called For Times Such as These, Radical's Guide to the Jewish Year. And, it's basically like kind of the natural follow up of that calendar project, where it's really like, like how do you contend with the fact that like every year on all of these different Jewish holidays, they become a sort of like trigger for settler violence, or like, how do you take the Zionism out of this Jewish holiday, or just like, how do you think about Jewishness through a radical leftist perspective, tied to these. I mean, the calendar is very important in Jewish life. And I've been consulting that book a lot because, now I do programming for Jewish Currents magazine, and like we're doing all these events that people are coming to us and being like, what do I do for, Shavuos that's like not at like, whatever shul that's going to be a bummer. And we have to figure out, what are we going to say in response to that? Like, are we going to be able to make these alternative public spaces? And, I think like the answer is we have to, right? Like we have to make the alternative objects and we have to make the alternative spaces in order to have an alternative narrative, in order to make an alternative future.
I'd like to say that's a beautiful place to stop, but I really want to ask one more question, if that's okay. So your book is about to come out. Yeah, exactly. We'll flip it so that ends the podcast. By the time this episode comes out, your book will be out, and I would imagine you will be tired from discussing it endlessly. I've started to see it kind of on social media. It's going to be amazing. I'm really excited to read it. Really excited to see you on your book tour when I saw you're coming to Philadelphia. But maybe one angle which is central to this podcast that you're not talking about as much is where education comes in here, and how that contributed to what the work is. I think both within the text, this, I wrote down here that one of the reviews I found describes it as a search for understanding, which I think that's bound up in education. But I think also the question that no artist or writer ever wants to be asked of what do you hope this does? What do you hope for this work? But I think, what do you hope it teaches?
Yeah, I have a pretty clear pedagogical hope for this book, or didactic hope for the book. I basically combined kind of two projects to create this. One was this sort of like personal obsession with my family history, where I was like trying to think about my own identity or my relationship to my family through this figure of Eric Levy, who left behind, very little trace of himself. Like I have one piece of writing that's in his voice, and it is an article that he wrote in his 20s about the efficacy of knocking people out in boxing matches. And other than that, any sort of like information that I have about him or stories that I have about him were told by my Oma, my great grandmother, and by his son, who, had a very contentious relation, who's my grandfather, who had a very contentious relationship with him. And then, Eric died when my grandfather was a teenager. So so kind of like searching for meaning through this historical figure and his life story on the one hand. And then on the other hand, I had been thinking about, because I was working as a US history teacher, and I was working on rewriting the curriculum for the high school that I worked at to really emphasize US history through the theoretical lens of settler colonialism. I'm really thinking about the history of the United States as a settler colony. And, basically being like, what would happen if we told the story of the United States as the story of a colony? And part of that is reintroducing Indigenous history, and part of that is like, twisting or turning the theoretical lens by which we're reading primary sources. And so I had this idea that I was going to do a nonfiction comic, like a book-length comic on settler colonialism that was going to be a teaching tool. The thing that happened was that because of my public politics, I was fired very publicly from that teaching job. There's I think the deck of the story about it in Tablet magazine was like, teacher tweets, "I do not support ethno-nationalist settler colonialism." I was like, I don't support ethnographic methods. But, so I was like, I don't support ethno-nationalist settler colonialism. So if that's why I'm getting fired, I don't know what to tell you. And so I was like, taken out of the context in which I was going to do this didactic project that I was really having students in mind, right? When I was thinking about this. And so the two projects really came together into this story that was like, what if I tell the story of my family as a story that is not just about a Jewish family that is victimized, but also about a German family that, is complicit in settler colonial genocide, as, an American family that took advantage of their own ascendance to whiteness when they came to the US. Like that, if you tell this longer story, and if you use this different theoretical framing or sort of this different narrative framing, then it really, it allows you to think about people and communities and history is actually very complicated, right? But this is not to say that actually the Jews were the bad guys in the story, but actually that we're all sometimes the bad guys and sometimes the good guys, and sometimes we don't do enough, and sometimes we, just let bad things happen because it's easier or more convenient. And that is a much better way to think about history, and a much more interesting way to think about human nature. And when we read that story, it lets us see, again, both the kind of human side of things differently, but also to really think about the structural scaffolding that creates the ways for these violences to keep proliferating and to continue into the present. And so, I continue, I said earlier that I was kind of someone who believes in future utopia. I'm a believer in the ability of history to give us lessons for the present, and that we can use history to create a better future. But we actually have to do work to do that. It's not just the arc of history is not bending towards anything. We're bending, So I hope that people will read the book and think about their own family histories and say I've inherited this story, and it contains, this very and this tends to be how family stories work, that it contains this sort of clean narrative where bad things happened to us. We were good people, we had to go here, we did this. But then it's okay, let's expand a little and see what was happening to the people around you. Let's see how you impacted the world in this, proliferating set of ways. And if you know that information, does it change the way that that you're moving in the world, or the things that you feel like you can intervene in? And so that's what I hope it does.
Thanks so much for listening. If you'd like to explore more from Solomon Brager, 100% buy their new book, Heavyweight. It's available now. They're also part of Cartoonists for Palestine, There's some awesome work on there that can be found at cartoonistforpalestine.org. Saul is also engaged in a lot of mutual aid work and has been donating specifically to the Gaza Scholarship Initiative for Displaced Students. We'll share links and further information on our Instagram and Twitter page. Please consider donating to the Gaza Scholarship Initiative for Displaced Students or somewhere like the Gaza Mutual Aid Collective.